At 93, Angie Dickinson finally talks about Randolph Scott. For over 70 years, famous Hollywood actress Angie Dickinson kept quiet about one of Hollywood's biggest secrets. Now, at 93, she's finally telling the truth about Randolph Scott, the tough Western movie star whose private life made people whisper and gossip. What Angie saw as a young actress at the movie studios would have ruined careers and destroyed carefully created images if anyone found out back then. But now, as one of the last people alive from Hollywood's golden days, Dickinson has decided the truth needs to be told. There comes a point, Dickinson said recently, when history matters more than Hollywood's secrets. And what she's finally sharing about Randolph Scott, the man who starred in over 100 movies while living a carefully hidden double life, changes everything we thought we knew about one of the most famous cowboys in movies. But why did Angie wait until now to break her silence? And what exactly did she see behind the studio gates that was so shocking it had to be kept secret for nearly 100 years? The answer shows not just the truth about Randolph Scott, but reveals the whole system that created Hollywood's golden myths and ruthlessly destroyed anyone who tried to break them. And he said, "How's Bert?" I said, "He's fine. He's at the hotel." Angie hints at the secret relationship with Cary Grant. To understand the big news that Angie Dickinson has finally shared about Randolph Scott, we need to go back to 1950s Hollywood, a world of beautiful appearances hiding countless secrets. Dickinson arrived in Hollywood in 1953, a pretty young woman from North Dakota who quickly got the attention of movie studio bosses and directors. By the time she met Randolph Scott, he was already a well-known Western star with decades of successful movies. But Scott's work reputation wasn't the only thing people talked about at the movie studios. For years, people had whispered about his unusually close relationship with Cary Grant. Between 1932 and 1944, the two stars had lived together in what the newspapers politely called a bachelor arrangement in their Santa Monica beach house. While the studios publicly said this was just friends saving money, behind closed doors, Hollywood insiders knew the real story. Back then, you didn't say anything if two men were living together, Dickinson revealed in her recent interview. But everyone knew. This simple statement, said with the straightforwardness that has defined Dickinson's career, basically confirmed what had been Hollywood's open secret for decades. What makes her statement especially important is that unlike many people who have guessed about Grant and Scott's relationship, Dickinson was actually there working at the same movie studios, hanging out in the same social circles. When I first arrived at the studios, I was immediately pulled aside by an older actress, Dickinson remembered. She pointed out certain stars in the lunchroom and whispered, "Don't ask questions about their personal lives if you want to keep your job." Randolph Scott was at the top of that list. This code of silence wasn't just about protecting individual actors, it was about protecting an entire system built on made-up images. Scott, with his tall, tough body and serious manner, had been carefully made into the ultimate symbol of American manliness. As the star of countless westerns, he represented the mythical cowboy hero. Strong, independent, and definitely straight. Any hint that said otherwise threatened not just Scott's career, but the studio's entire business plan. The publicity departments worked extra hard creating romantic connections between certain stars, Dickinson explained. Randolph was often photographed with beautiful actresses at movie premieres and events. It was all carefully planned. Despite these arranged public appearances, rumors about Scott and Grant continued. The studio's solution was simple, but it worked. They arranged marriages for both men. Grant would eventually marry 5 times, while Scott married twice, including a marriage to heirs Patricia Stillman that lasted from 1944 until his death in 1987. His marriage to Patricia came right after he and Cary stopped living together. Dickinson noted the timing wasn't an accident. Nothing in Hollywood ever was. The interesting part of Dickinson's revelations isn't just the confirmation of long-time rumors, but her insight into how these arrangements affected the people involved. According to Dickinson, The pressure of keeping up these fake personas created tension you could feel that came from stars like Scott. You could feel it when he entered a room. This guardedness, this distance, he was playing a role even when the cameras weren't rolling. That takes a huge toll on a person over time. What makes Dickinson's perspective especially valuable is that she herself was part of the studio system, yet kept enough independence to watch its workings with a critical eye. As a young contract player, she was expected to play the same publicity games, being linked romantically with various co-stars to get press attention. "We were all playing parts given to us by the studios," she said. "The difference was that some of us were allowed to stop acting when we left the set. Others, like Randolph, never had that luxury." Dickinson has been careful not to present herself as a close friend of Scott's. Instead, her revelations come from the unique perspective of someone who saw Hollywood's inner workings while staying somewhat on the outside, close enough to see the truth, but not so deeply involved that she couldn't recognize the manipulation happening. Angie didn't confirm the relationship directly, but her silence said enough, and now she's not staying silent anymore. As one film historian put it when discussing how important Dickinson's recent honesty is, perhaps most touching, Dickinson revealed that years later, after both she and Scott had mostly retired from acting, they briefly ran into each other at an industry event. "He looked at me with this expression that seemed to say, 'You know, don't you?' And I gave him a look back that said, 'Yes, and it's okay.' It was the most honest interaction I ever had with him, and we never exchanged a single word. That wordless exchange says a lot about the unspoken understanding that existed among Hollywood insiders, a shared knowledge of the gap between public personas and private realities. That's a toughie there. There's a lot of that's like picking." She reveals the fear everyone had around Randolph Scott. Beyond confirming the long-time rumors about Scott's personal life, Dickinson's revelations give amazing insight into how the pressure of keeping up his public image affected Scott's behavior and relationships with colleagues. According to Dickinson, Scott developed a reputation for being extremely guarded and distant, traits that many mistook for arrogance or coldness. "He was handsome, but you never felt warmth, just tension," Dickinson recalled. "He never made eye contact in the lunchroom, just tipped his hat and disappeared." This description is very different from Scott's on-screen persona, where his quiet nature was shown as quiet strength and dignified restraint. In reality, Dickinson suggests this emotional distance was a defensive mechanism, a way to prevent anyone from getting close enough to discover the truth behind the carefully built facade. "Everyone walked on eggshells around him," she explained, "not because he was mean or temperamental like some stars, but because there was this unspoken understanding that certain topics were absolutely off-limits. You could feel the invisible boundaries around him. This atmosphere of caution extended beyond just Scott himself to include anyone working with him professionally. Directors, co-stars, and crew members all understood without being told that questions about Scott's personal life were forbidden. According to Dickinson, this created a strange dynamic on sets where Scott was working, a forced superficiality that prevented the natural friendship that usually happens during production. "There was always this elephant in the room," she said. "Everyone working with him was participating in this big pretense, and it created this underlying current of worry. People were afraid of accidentally saying the wrong thing, asking the wrong question, or even looking at him the wrong way." What Dickinson describes is basically a workplace built on collective fear. Fear of triggering Scott's discomfort, fear of the studio's punishment, and ultimately fear of disrupting the entire system that kept everyone employed. This environment of controlled silence was enforced not just through clear warnings, but through the obvious lessons of those who had broken these unwritten rules. There was an actor, I won't say his name, who made a joke, just a casual remark about Randolph and Carrie. Dickinson recalled, "Nothing explicit, just a little hint." His contract wasn't renewed the next day. Nobody had to spell it out. We all got the message. This climate of fear wasn't unique to Scott's situation. But according to Dickinson, it was especially intense around him because of his status as a Western star, a symbol of traditional American masculinity that had extra cultural importance during the conservative 1940s and 1950s. Western heroes were held to a different standard, she explained. They represented this mythical American ideal, the self-sufficient, rugged individualist taming the frontier. The studios invested tremendously in maintaining that image, especially during the Cold War, when American identity was so tied up with these symbols. What made Scott's situation even more dangerous was his real talent and popularity. Unlike some stars whose private lives were protected mainly because they made money at the box office, Scott was a truly skilled actor who brought depth and authenticity to his roles. Dickinson noted that this created additional layers of complexity in how he was seen and protected. He wasn't just a pretty face they could replace if scandal broke. She said he had this real connection with audiences. People trusted Randolph. His films made them feel safe in uncertain times. The studios weren't just protecting an investment. They were protecting a symbol. This observation offers an interesting insight into why the studios went to such extreme lengths to maintain Scott's public image. It wasn't simply about protecting profits. It was about preserving a cultural touchstone that audiences relied on for comfort and stability during difficult historical periods. Dickinson also revealed that Scott seemed very aware of the impossible position he was in. You'd catch him sometimes when he thought no one was looking with this expression of absolute exhaustion. She recalled, not physical tiredness, this deeper weariness that comes from living a divided life year after year. This psychological toll showed up in Scott's increasingly reclusive behavior as his career went on. While other stars of his era loved the social parts of Hollywood life, Scott became known for turning down invitations and leaving events early. According to Dickinson, this wasn't just about protecting his secrets, but about the sheer emotional energy required to maintain his public persona. Being Randolph Scott, the movie star, wasn't just a job for him. It was a performance that never ended. She explained that kind of constant watchfulness, always watching your words, your expressions, who you look at, and how. It's exhausting. I think he retreated from public life as much as possible because those were the only moments he could breathe. Perhaps most revealing in Dickinson's account is her description of the rare times when Scott's guard momentarily slipped. Once on a studio lot, I saw him talking with a young male actor. For just a moment, his face changed. There was lightness, real animation in his expression. Then he noticed people watching, and it was like a door slamming shut. The mask came back instantly, but in that brief moment, I saw someone completely different from the Randolph Scott. Everyone thought they knew. These glimpses of authenticity, according to Dickinson, made the artificial nature of Hollywood's star system all the more obvious and troubling. Angie says he carried something inside him, and the studios made sure no one ever saw it. As one film historian summarized her revelations, I said, "I'll give you 4 years, but that's it." And then they took the 4 years. She exposes the studio's handling of Scott's image. Perhaps the most important part of Dickinson's revelations concerns the complicated machinery that studios used to create and maintain Scott's public image. As someone who entered Hollywood during the end of the studio system era, Dickinson saw firsthand the transition from total studio control to the more independent film industry that would emerge in the 1960s and 1970s. I was directly told not to gossip about certain stars, especially the ones who had something to hide. Dickinson revealed the studio could turn anyone into a cowboy, a war hero, a husband. It didn't mean it was true. This statement gets to the heart of Hollywood's golden age, the gap between the carefully built personas shown to the public and the actual individuals behind them. In Scott's case, this manipulation was especially complete and went on for decades. According to Dickinson, Scott's image maintenance began with the careful selection of his roles. While he sometimes appeared in other types of movies, the studios deliberately positioned him mainly in westerns, where his natural quietness could be seen as stoic strength. rather than emotional guardedness. His roles were chosen to reinforce certain qualities: honor, straightforwardness, traditional values, Dickinson explained. These weren't just entertainment choices. They were strategic decisions to build a specific type of public perception. Beyond role selection, the studios used a many-sided approach to crafting Scott's public persona. This included carefully arranged photo opportunities, carefully planted newspaper stories, and strategic public appearances, all designed to reinforce his image as the embodiment of traditional American masculinity. There were women hired to accompany him to premieres and events, Dickinson revealed. Beautiful women who knew exactly what to say to reporters about their relationship with him. It was all choreographed down to the smallest detail. This level of image manipulation extended to controlling who could interview Scott and what questions could be asked. According to Dickinson, studio publicity departments would give journalists pre-approved questions and topics with the clear understanding that going off script would result in loss of access not just to Scott, but to all of the studio's stars. Interviews weren't really interviews at all, she explained. They were staged performances with scripts just as carefully written as any film. The questions, the answers, even the candid moments were all predetermined. Perhaps most disturbing in Dickinson's account is her description of the studio's more forceful tactics when regular image management wasn't enough. While she is careful not to name specific executives or incidents, her implications are clear. Those who threatened to disrupt the carefully maintained facade faced serious consequences. There were fixers whose job was to make problems disappear, she said. Sometimes that meant paying people off, sometimes it meant intimidation, and sometimes it meant creating entire alternative stories to distract from potential scandals. This system of control was especially effective because it operated at multiple levels at once. Studio contracts gave executives huge power over actors' professional lives, while the social dynamics of Hollywood created additional pressure to conform. Add to this the broader societal attitudes of the era, which were deeply hostile to any deviation from heterosexual norms, and the result was a nearly inescapable system of control. It wasn't just the studios, Dickinson clarified. It was the press, the public, the government. Everyone was invested in maintaining these illusions. The studios just happened to be the ones orchestrating it all. What makes Dickinson's perspective especially valuable is that she observed this system both as someone subject to its demands and as someone with enough distance to recognize its fundamental dishonesty. Unlike many stars of the era who were either complicit in maintaining these illusions or too deeply embedded to see them clearly, Dickinson maintained a certain critical distance. "I was fortunate," she acknowledged. "I came in as the system was already beginning to weaken. I could see the cracks in the facade that others couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge." This unique vantage point allowed Dickinson to recognize the deep personal cost of the image manipulation that defined Scott's career. According to her, what was presented to the public as the essence of American authenticity was in reality one of Hollywood's most elaborate fabrications. The great irony is that Randolph Scott became a symbol of straightforward honesty and directness. The man who always told the truth and stood by his word while being forced to live a fundamental lie, she observed. I don't know how anyone reconciles that kind of contradiction within themselves. The psychological impact of this forced duality clearly troubled Dickinson, who noted that Scott seemed to grow increasingly distant and reserved as his career progressed. The longer it went on, the more the performance consumed the man. She said, "It's like he gradually disappeared inside the character they created for him." This observation speaks to the dehumanizing aspect of the studio system, its tendency to transform actual people into products that could be shaped, marketed, and controlled without regard for their authentic selves. In Scott's case, this transformation was especially complete and long-lasting. According to Angie, Randolph Scott wasn't just a star. He was a story the studio needed America to believe, as one film historian summarized her revelations. Perhaps most touching in Dickinson's account is her suggestion that Scott himself eventually came to see the artifice of his public persona as a kind of prison from which he could never escape. Even after he retired, he maintained the image, she noted. By then, I think the lines between the real man and the fake image had blurred, even for him. When you live a role for that long, it becomes nearly impossible to separate yourself from it. This observation offers a deep insight into the lasting damage caused by the studio system's approach to image management. For Scott, the consequences extended far beyond his active career, shaping his identity and relationships until the end of his life. Not really what you were after, and so I was looking for any relief in my life. The relationship's legacy and hidden Hollywood. Dickinson's revelations about Scott's relationship with Grant show not just their personal story, but an entire hidden dimension of Hollywood's golden age. According to Dickinson, the Scott-Grant relationship was far from unique. It was simply one of the more persistent open secrets in an industry built on controlled illusions. Hollywood has always had a shadow history running alongside its official story, she explained. The real stories, the true relationships, the actual personalities behind the personas, those were known to insiders but systematically hidden from the public. This dual reality created what Dickinson describes as two Hollywoods: the manufactured fantasy presented to audiences and the complex, often contradictory reality experienced by those within the industry. For stars like Scott, navigating between these worlds required extraordinary discipline and psychological compartmentalization. What audiences never understood is that many of the stars they idolized were basically playing two roles at the same time: their characters on screen and their public personas off-screen. She observed the authentic person behind both performances remained hidden sometimes for their entire lives. This perspective offers a deep reconsideration of Hollywood's golden age. Rather than the straightforward glamour often shown in retrospectives, Dickinson reveals an era defined by elaborate deception and psychological complexity. The glittering premieres, romantic pairings, and perfect families presented to the public were often as carefully staged as any movie scene. The studio system wasn't just about making films, she explained. It was about creating an entire alternate reality, one where stars embodied whatever qualities audiences wanted to see, regardless of the truth. For Scott and Grant, this manufactured reality meant decades of hiding their authentic selves behind carefully constructed public images. According to Dickinson, this deception extended far beyond simple privacy. It required active participation in elaborate charades designed to reinforce heterosexual norms. The studio publicity departments worked overtime, creating romantic narratives for certain stars. She noted for someone like Randolph that meant a constant stream of arranged dates, manufactured relationship stories, and eventually marriages that served purposes beyond personal fulfillment. What Dickinson finds especially troubling in retrospect is how this system of deception was normalized within the industry. The extraordinary measures taken to hide Scott's relationship with Grant weren't seen as unusual or problematic. They were simply standard operating procedure for stars whose authentic lives didn't align with public expectations. Nobody questioned it. She recalled this elaborate machinery of deception was just how business was done. The human cost wasn't part of the calculation. This observation speaks to the fundamentally exploitative nature of the studio system. Its willingness to sacrifice personal authenticity and psychological well-being for commercial success and public image. Stars like Scott weren't just expected to perform on screen. They were required to perform their entire lives with no clear boundary between professional obligations and personal existence. The tragedy isn't just that they couldn't be open about their relationship, Dickinson reflected. It's that they were forced to actively deny their authentic selves year after year, decade after decade. That kind of sustained deception does something to a person's soul. This psychological cost showed up differently in Scott and Grant. According to Dickinson, while Grant eventually developed a reputation for charm and friendliness despite his carefully guarded private life, Scott became increasingly withdrawn and serious, a man who seemed constantly on guard against revealing too much of himself. Carey found ways to create distance through charm and humor, she explained. Randolph's strategy was more about physical and emotional withdrawal, minimizing interactions to minimize the risk of exposure. The relationship between Scott and Grant remains important not just as a personal story, but as a window into the broader patterns of deception that defined Hollywood's golden age. According to Dickinson, their story shows the gap between the values these films supposedly celebrated: authenticity, honesty, integrity, and the actual practices of the industry that produced them. The great irony is that Randolph made a career playing characters defined by their straightforwardness and moral clarity, she observed. Meanwhile, the system that created those films was forcing him to live a fundamental lie. This contradiction between Hollywood's projected values and its actual practices creates what Dickinson describes as a moral vertigo when reconsidering films from this era. The Western genre, in particular, with its emphasis on honor and authenticity, takes on new complexity when viewed through the lens of the deceptions required of its stars. When you watch Randolph Scott stand tall and speak truth in those Westerns, knowing what we know now about what was happening behind the scenes, it creates this deep dissonance, she reflected. You're watching someone forced to hide his authentic self, playing a character defined by never hiding who he is. That's a kind of tragic irony that Shakespeare would recognize. It all kind of mixed together. And had I met him before, I don't remember. The Price of Silence. One of the most touching aspects of Dickinson's revelations is her insight into how the enforced silence around Scott's personal life affected not just his public image, but his internal sense of self. According to Dickinson, the psychological cost of maintaining this deception for decades was huge and lasting. There's a particular kind of damage that comes from never being able to acknowledge your own truth, she explained. It creates this permanent gap between how the world sees you and who you know yourself to be. This observation speaks to a deep psychological burden carried not just by Scott, but by many stars of Hollywood's golden age. The studio system's approach to image management didn't just control how celebrities appeared to the public. It fundamentally limited their ability to develop authentic identities and relationships. The system didn't just require them to hide certain aspects of themselves, Dickinson noted. It demanded they actively present a false self to the world. That's not just privacy. That's a form of enforced self-betrayal. For Scott, according to Dickinson, this enforced self-betrayal showed up in a growing emotional remoteness that characterized his interactions both on and off set. As the years passed, he seemed to retreat further into himself, maintaining fewer genuine connections and revealing less of his authentic thoughts and feelings. There was a sadness about him that deepened over time, she recalled. Not dramatic or showy, but this quiet resignation, like someone who had accepted that certain doors in life were permanently closed to him. This resignation extended beyond his personal relationships to shape his artistic choices and career path. According to Dickinson, Scott increasingly chose roles and projects that required minimal personal revelation or emotional vulnerability, reinforcing the stoic, reserved persona that provided maximum protection for his private self. His later westerns especially became almost like a uniform he could hide behind. She observed the more iconic and simplified the characters became, the less of himself he had to reveal through them. This retreat into increasingly stylized performances represents a significant artistic loss. In Dickinson's view, she believes Scott possessed greater depth and range as an actor than he was ultimately able to express, largely because genuine emotional vulnerability on screen risked exposing the very aspects of himself he had been trained to conceal. There are moments in his films, brief, powerful moments, where you catch glimpses of the emotional complexity he was capable of expressing, she said. But those moments became rarer as his career progressed. The defenses became too ingrained to lower even for a performance. This artistic limitation speaks to a broader cultural loss resulting from Hollywood's rigid enforcement of heterosexual norms. By forcing actors like Scott to maintain certain public personas regardless of their authentic selves, the studio system effectively limited the range of human experience and emotion that could be explored on screen. We'll never know what kind of performances he might have given in a different world, Dickinson reflected, one where he didn't have to devote so much energy to hiding essential aspects of himself. Beyond the artistic limitations, Dickinson believes the enforced silence had deep personal consequences for Scott. According to her observations, maintaining the deception required him to distance himself, not just from the public, but from potential genuine connections of all kinds. The safest strategy when you're hiding something fundamental about yourself is to keep everyone at arm's length, she explained. You can never fully relax, never completely trust, because there's always the fear of revealing too much. This constant guardedness created a kind of isolation that Dickinson finds especially tragic, given Scott's natural warmth and intelligence. Based on her limited but meaningful interactions with him, she believes he possessed qualities of thoughtfulness and sensitivity that few people ever had the opportunity to experience. The moments when his guard dropped, even briefly, revealed someone quite different from the stoic figure he usually presented, she recalled. There was humor there and kindness and a kind of gentle perceptiveness about people, but those qualities rarely had the chance to emerge. Perhaps most touching in Dickinson's account is her belief that Scott was very aware of the bargain he had made, trading authentic self-expression for professional success and social acceptance. According to her, this awareness showed up as a kind of resigned sadness that became increasingly obvious in his later years. There was a moment at an industry event near the end of his active career, she remembered. Someone was giving one of those lifetime achievement speeches, talking about how Randolph Scott had always stood for integrity and truth. I happened to be looking at him when they said it, and there was this fleeting expression that crossed his face. Not quite bitterness, but this deep irony. He knew better than anyone the gap between the image and the reality. This awareness of the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his public persona represents, in Dickinson's view, the true tragedy of Scott's story. It wasn't simply that he couldn't live openly. It was that he was required to actively participate in promoting values that the system denied him the opportunity to embody in his own life. The cruelest part was making him a symbol of the very authenticity he wasn't allowed to live. She observed that creates a wound that never really heals. You loved me. I said I'd arrest you. It means the same thing. You know that. You just won't say it. Why Angie is speaking now? One of the most interesting questions raised by Dickinson's revelations is why she chose to break her silence about Scott after so many decades. According to her, this decision wasn't made lightly or without careful thought about the ethical implications of discussing someone who can no longer speak for himself. I wouldn't have felt right talking about this while Randolph was alive, she explained, or even shortly after his death. Some might question why I'm speaking now, but I believe there comes a point when historical truth becomes more important than keeping these old secrets. This perspective shows Dickinson's thoughtful consideration of competing ethical principles, respecting individual privacy versus acknowledging historical reality. Her decision to speak now, more than 3 decades after Scott's death in 1987, represents a carefully considered judgment about when the balance shifts from protecting an individual to illuminating a broader historical pattern. This isn't just about Randolph and Carrie as individuals, she clarified. It's about understanding an entire system that shaped not just their lives, but American culture more broadly. These weren't isolated cases. This was systematic deception on a massive scale. Dickinson is also motivated by a desire to correct what she sees as historical distortions that continue to influence how we understand Hollywood's golden age. By presenting sanitized versions of stars' lives, traditional Hollywood histories perpetuate misunderstandings about both individual figures and the industry as a whole. When we pretend these lives were simpler or more conventional than they actually were, we're continuing the very deceptions that the studio system put in place, she observed. At some point, We have to break that cycle of managed mythology and look at the more complex reality. This commitment to historical accuracy reflects Dickinson's broader integrity as a witness to Hollywood's evolution. Throughout her career, she has been known for her straightforwardness and unwillingness to participate in the more exploitative aspects of celebrity culture. Her decision to speak about Scott now extends this ethical stance into how we remember and understand Hollywood's past. I'm at a point in my life where I don't have anything to gain or lose by sharing what I witnessed, she noted. My only interest is in contributing to a more honest understanding of that era before those of us who were there are all gone. This sense of limited time adds urgency to Dickinson's decision. As one of the few remaining actors who worked during the latter days of the studio system, she feels a responsibility to share her first-hand observations before they are lost forever. There's a narrowing window for first-hand accounts of that era, she explained. Once those of us who were actually there are gone, all that will be left are the official narratives and second-hand stories. I think we owe it to history to speak honestly about what we witnessed while we still can. Beyond these historical considerations, Dickinson is also motivated by a sense that modern society is finally ready to reconsider these stories with greater depth and compassion. The changing attitudes toward LGBTQ+ issues make it possible to discuss figures like Scott in a context that acknowledges both the constraints they faced and the courage they showed in navigating those limitations. 50 years ago, these conversations would have still carried the same stigma that forced them into hiding, she noted. Now we can talk about their lives with the complexity and respect they deserve. This changing context allows for a reframing of Scott's story, not as scandalous or shameful, but as a testament to remarkable resilience in the face of systematic constraints. Rather than diminishing his legacy, Dickinson believes that acknowledging the full complexity of his life enhances our understanding of his accomplishments both as an actor and as a person. When you consider what he achieved while carrying that additional burden of concealment and performance, it's actually more impressive, not less. She observed the sheer stamina and discipline required to maintain that double life while building a successful career. It's extraordinary. This perspective offers a more complete understanding of Scott than either uncritical worship or reductive scandal-mongering would provide. By acknowledging both the constraints he faced and the choices he made within those constraints, Dickinson presents a fully human portrait that respects his complexity without either idealizing or demonizing him. I hope people understand that I'm sharing these memories not to sensationalize or diminish, but to complete the picture. She emphasized to acknowledge the full humanity of someone who wasn't allowed to present his complete self to the world during his lifetime. This commitment to honoring Scott's full humanity reflects Dickinson's fundamental respect for him as both a colleague and a fellow traveler through Hollywood's complex terrain. Her revelations are offered not as expose but as restoration, an attempt to return to Scott the complexity and authenticity that the studio systematically denied him. In a way, speaking now is the only thing I can do for him, she reflected, to acknowledge the truth that he wasn't permitted to acknowledge himself. There's a kind of belated justice in that. I think Angie Dickinson's revelations about Randolph Scott offer more than just clearing up of long-standing Hollywood rumors. They provide a window into the human cost of fame during Hollywood's golden age. Through her first-hand observations, we gain insight into the complicated machinery of deception that shaped not just public perceptions, but the private lives and identities of the stars themselves. What emerges from Dickinson's account is a portrait of Scott as a man of remarkable discipline and strength, who navigated extraordinary constraints while building one of Hollywood's most enduring careers. Far from diminishing his accomplishments, understanding the additional burdens he carried only enhances our appreciation of what he achieved both professionally and personally. More broadly, Dickinson's revelations invite us to reconsider the entire mythology of Hollywood's golden age with more nuanced and compassionate eyes. Behind the glamorous facades and carefully crafted public images were real people navigating complex realities with the limited options available to them. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as scandals or simplicities, but as testament to human resilience in the face of systematic constraints. As one of the last living links to this vanishing era, Dickinson offers us a final opportunity to hear first-hand testimony about a Hollywood that existed behind the official narratives and carefully managed public images. Her willingness to share these observations now, when they can no longer harm those involved, represents a valuable contribution to our understanding of both individual lives and broader cultural patterns. The studio system created magnificent films and unforgettable stars, Dickinson observed in her closing reflections, but it did so at a tremendous human cost that we're only beginning to fully understand. I hope that by sharing what I witnessed, I can contribute to a more complete and compassionate history of that era. This more complete history doesn't diminish the artistic achievements of Hollywood's golden age, but it does invite us to view them within a more complex context, one that acknowledges both the beauty of what was created on screen and the often painful realities that existed behind the cameras. In this more nuanced understanding lies a deeper appreciation for the remarkable individuals who navigated these contradictions to create the enduring work that continues to captivate audiences today. In the final analysis, Angie Dickinson's revelations about Randolph Scott aren't just about setting the historical record straight. They're about honoring the full humanity of someone who wasn't permitted to present his complete self to the world during his lifetime. By speaking now, when society has evolved enough to receive these truths with understanding rather than judgment, she offers a belated but meaningful acknowledgement of the complex reality behind one of Hollywood's most carefully maintained facades.